Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. I'm your Bible teacher, Pastor B.E.Winship. On Monday, July 4th, the Supreme Court announced that it had ruled in favor of Jack Phillips, overturning the Colorado Supreme Court's decision that Jack Phillips had violated the law in not baking a cake for a homosexual wedding. So let's review that case. Back in 2012, a same-sex couple came into Phillips' bake shop and asked him to bake a wedding cake for a homosexual wedding, their wedding. Phillips said he was a Christian and he doesn't make cakes celebrating homosexual marriages, just like he doesn't make Halloween cakes with witches, or he doesn't make cakes with suggestive wording. These two homosexuals cursed him, made obscene gestures, and walked out of his shop. They then filed a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. The commission fined Phillips under the state's public accommodation law that a business owner cannot discriminate on the basis of race, religion, gender, or sexual orientation. Now remember, this was before homosexual marriage was legal in the United States or legal in Colorado. So the homosexual activists on the Colorado Civil Rights Commission fined Phillips for not supporting an activity that was illegal. This is how judicially active the homosexual lobby is. They have shown themselves not to really care about the law or logic. Homosexuality trumps every other consideration. This is postmodern relativism that believes reason and logic are meaningless. The only thing that matters is self-fulfillment. And so Philip was fined by the commission. They required him and his employees to be re-educated in LGBT accommodation. The commission required Phillips to submit compliance reports to the commission for the next 2 years. Well, Phillips and the ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, took the case to the Colorado Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in Colorado ruled against Phillips. The argument used by the court was very weak. The court did not get into the issue of religious freedom, freedom of conscience. The court simply stated that Phillips' refusal to bake a cake for a homosexual wedding is not a necessary religious conviction. Well, Phillips and the ADF appealed to the Supreme Court. And last week, the Supreme Court ruled in Phillips' favor. And this case was one of the clearest cases in regard to the exercise of religious liberty. Jack Phillips was consistent in not participating in any practice that was against his religious faith. He had turned away making other cakes that disagreed with his Christian faith. He was not discriminating against homosexuals. A homosexual could come into his shop and buy anything on the shelf, but Phillips would not make a cake with a logo specifically celebrating homosexuality. Just like a t-shirt manufacturer doesn't have to make t-shirts supporting a Planned Parenthood event or an anti-Planned Parenthood event, nor does a t-shirt manufacturer have to support a political party. A Democratic printer doesn't have to make a sign supporting Republicans. Advertising agencies don't have to accept all clients and all products. You're not forced to advertise for the KKK or the Communist Party. An Orthodox Jewish deli owner doesn't have to make pork sandwiches, nor does he have to make something for the public on the Sabbath. As Justice Gorsuch wrote in his concurring opinion, businesses are entitled to reject orders for any number of reasons, including because they deem a particular product requested by a customer to be offensive. Well, this is freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, and if this ever gets overthrown, America will be a completely different nation. We will then be living under a police state where the government decides all public morals. And again, Phillips' beliefs had nothing to do with discriminating against homosexuals. It was about supporting immorality or homosexuality. If a straight family member of the homosexuals came in and asked Philip to bake a cake with a logo celebrating a homosexual marriage, he wouldn't make it. Now, the LGBT lobby has worked to make homosexuality a protected class, like one's ethnicity. But in Jack Phillips' case, that argument would not hold. It wouldn't apply because Phillips would serve homosexuals, just like any business owner would serve someone of any ethnicity. Now, according to current law, even though the law requires you to serve people of all ethnicities, you are not required to support the ideology associated with any particular ethnicity. You're not required to make a white supremacy cake, or a Black Panther cake, or a Mohammed cake. You are not required to make something supporting an ideology that may be tangentially connected to a particular ethnicity or religion or sex. But when it comes to homosexuality, the LGBT community and their supporters want special rights and accommodations because they want to stamp out all opposition to their lifestyle. They want the government to persecute those who ideologically or religiously object to their behavior. And again, back to Genesis chapter 19. It's not enough that they were able to practice immorality in Sodom. They had to force their way into Lot's house to make him accept their practices. So, you see how this masterpiece case, legally and rationally, is an open and closed case for Jack Phillips. I want us to see the rationale of this case because some Christians, not understanding the case, not understanding the importance of the case, are saying this is not a sword to fall on. Christians should provide food for homosexuals. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, I did not at all mean you are not to associate with the immoral people of this world. Or 1 Corinthians 5:12, what have we to do with judging outsiders? And in the Gospels, Jesus said, love your enemies. God sends rain on the just and the unjust. Therefore, he sends rain on the homosexual and the heterosexual. Therefore, the logic being we need to provide cakes for homosexuals. And what a great opportunity to witness to homosexuals. But this case was not about loving or feeding one's enemy. This is about the government forcing Christians to practice sin, to perform a homosexual wedding, to print pornography, to sell marijuana, to perform an abortion, or to sell abortifacient drugs. This is about the state requiring those early Christians to burn incense to Caesar, to engage in idolatry. This is Revelation chapter 13. You cannot buy or sell unless you take the mark of the beast. What does God say here? Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11. Do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness. Or 1 Corinthians 10:21. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Or 2 John 11. Do not even give such a people a greeting. Which means in the ancient world, a public affirmation. For the one who gives him a greeting participates in his evil deeds. We're not to participate in evil deeds. So this is not about Jesus eating and drinking with sinners. This would be more analogous to Jesus paying to build a brothel or paying to build an idol to Aphrodite's. So when it comes to supporting and sponsoring sin, the Christian must refuse. Acts chapter 5, verse 29. Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. And so the Supreme Court fortunately ruled in favor of Jack Phillips in a 7-2 decision. And all the conservatives cheered until they had time to read the ruling. The courts did not rule in favor of Jack Phillips strictly on the basis of First Amendment rights, freedom of religion, but on the basis that, quote, law must be applied in a manner that is neutral toward religion. So, what does that mean? Well, the courts made an ambiguous ruling that since the Colorado Civil Rights Commission ruled with animus, then it was unfair. Which brings up the question, what if the Colorado Commission was nice to Phillips and didn't attack his religious faith? Could then Phillips' First Amendment rights be overturned? Here's a statement from the ruling. Phillips was entitled to a neutral and respectful consideration of his claims in all of the circumstances of the case. That consideration was compromised, however, by the Commission's treatment of Phillips' case, which showed elements of clear, impermissible hostility toward the sincere religious beliefs motivating his objection. As the record shows, some of the commissioners at the Commission's formal public hearings endorsed the view that religious beliefs cannot legitimately be carried into the public sphere or commercial domain, disparaged Phillips' faith as despicable and characterized it as merely rhetorical, and compared his invocation of his sincerely held religious beliefs to defenses of slavery and the Holocaust. No commissioners objected to the comments, nor were they mentioned in the later state court rulings or disavowed in the briefs filed here. The comments thus cast doubt on the fairness and the impartiality of the Commission's adjudication of Phillips' case. And so the courts ruled that the Commission was not being fair and impartial. The ruling did not seem to definitively decide that First Amendment rights guarantee a person's right not to be forced to do something against his or her religious convictions. And to prove the weakness of this ruling, 4 days after the Supreme Court ruled on the Masterpiece Cake case, the Arizona Court of Appeals ruled against a Christian wedding decoration company that refused to sell customized products for a homosexual wedding. And the case that the Arizona Appeals Court used to justify their decision, this recent Supreme Court Masterpiece Cake decision. Headlines: the Arizona Court of Appeals interprets the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to protect gay couples' right to equal access. Because the Supreme Court, by mainly rebuking the bias of the Colorado Commission, opened the doors for lower courts to rule that Christians can be discriminated against as long as it looks like the government agencies are being fair and impartial. Quote, the Arizona Court of Appeals ruling provides the first indication that, as many predicted, the judiciary will construe Masterpiece Cake Shop to affirm the constitutionality of civil rights measures that protect LGBTQ Americans. But here is another article from The Hill claiming that the Masterpiece ruling was not so narrow, and it will protect the religious rights of not having to accommodate to homosexual activity. Quote, the Supreme Court said that tolerance is a two-way street and that Jack Phillips could not be forced by the Colorado Civil Rights Commission to create wedding cakes for a ceremony that would violate his conscience. Some have asserted that this recent ruling is narrow and that it sets slim legal precedent. In fact, the opposite is true. Here's another article from the Daily Signal: why the Supreme Court ruling for a Christian baker was not narrow. And the author's point was that the left has only been saying that it is narrow so that they can ignore the ruling. However, the Supreme Court could have better written this decision to remove all of this ambiguity. And it looks like what the Supreme Court was doing in this ruling was kicking the can down the road rather than dealing with this whole issue. because the more liberal justices know that the nation might not be ready to accept homosexual rights over Christian rights. And so they don't want a strong Supreme Court precedent ruling in favor of the Christians, so they prevaricate it. Now, another case is just applied to be heard by the Supreme Court. Arlene Flowers in Washington State, Baronella Stutzman, who refused to supply flowers to a gay wedding, and the Supreme Court in Washington ruled against her, and so she has appealed to the Supreme Court. And if this case is heard, it will definitely be a deciding case. Now, let's switch gears here from this legal case to discuss what's really going on in the hearts of people. The 59 pages of the Masterpiece Cake decision was a hard read, filled with all sorts of legal jargon. But what is really happening is that the unsaved, the natural mind, is creating all sorts of legal justification for sin. George Orwell, who wasn't even a Christian, understood this. He said political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give the appearance of solidity to mere wind. Or as the prophet Isaiah said about the wicked, Isaiah 29:21, they cause a person to be indicted by a word and ensnare him who adjudicates at the gate, and defraud the one in the right with meaningless arguments. And the idea in the Hebrew here is empty, void arguments that are used to overturn righteousness. And this is what the courts have done. They have found the right of privacy in the Constitution to justify the murder of children in the womb. They have found the right of public accommodation in the Constitution to justify the legalization of gross immoralities and to overturn the freedom of religion. And what's behind all this is the strong desire to justify sin. If homosexuality and abortion weren't so loved, no one would ever even think of using the right of privacy or the right of public accommodation to legalize such practices. And what was really frightening about the Masterpiece Cake ruling is that Justice Ginsburg and Justice Sotomayor ruled against Jack Phillips. In their minds, homosexuality is to be so defended that it trumps any First Amendment rights to freedom of religion. Justice Gorsuch and Alito, the conservatives, in their opinion, rebuked Ginsburg and Sotomayor, saying that they had no basis for claiming that the commission acted fairly and was consistent with First Amendment rights. You know, I believe that the Christian community just needs to wake up and realize this growing push for immorality in America. I believe I mentioned last week, back in 2015, when the Supreme Court legalized homosexual marriage, it wasn't as if the politicians were simply giving into the practice. They actually lobbied the Supreme Court to legalize homosexual marriage. Quote from Politico, March 2015, Democratic leaders, Representative Nancy Pelosi and Senator Harry Reid, along with 209 other members of Congress, 209, filed an amicus brief to the Supreme Court Friday urging justices to rule for marriage equality. You know, some of us have been so deluded by the culture that we think, oh, how nice. They're defending the freedoms of others. No, they're supporting men marrying men. Romans chapter 1, degrading passions, women exchanging the natural function for that which is unnatural, men with men committing indecent acts. This is God giving people over to a depraved mind where they don't even have a pang of conscience against homosexuality and perversion. You know, just a few years ago, we might have all wondered how homosexuality and perversion was justified in Sodom and Pompeii, but now we know. People come to consider it normal and good because they have so departed from their belief in God and God's authority that their minds become darkened Romans chapter 1, verse 21. So in this darkness, they will favor the entire homosexual agenda over Christianity. In the Masterpiece Cake ruling, the courts actually mentioned that in Colorado, there were 3 cases where people walked into homosexual supporting bake shops and asked the baker to make a cake that was anti-LGBT, anti-gay marriage, and those bakers refused. The Colorado Commission, rather than siding with the customer, sided with the homosexual baker. The Civil Rights Commission said that those bakers do not have to bake an anti-LGBT cake, but the Christian baker must bake an LGBT cake. Well, is that fair? Of course not. But it is not about fairness when people begin to believe that homosexuality is intrinsically right and Christian morality is intrinsically wrong. And this is what we get even in a country that professes to have freedom of religion. Because what happens when the freedom of the religion of secular humanism conflicts with the freedom of Christianity? Whose values triumph? Baal worship or Jehovah worship? In the First Amendment, what takes precedent? In 170 AD, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius passed a law against Christianity. Anyone endeavoring to influence people's minds by fear of the divinity was to be exiled. And this law was to prevent Christians from witnessing to unbelievers. The Christian apologist at this time, Melito, wrote, "The race of the worshippers of God in Asia, the Christians, are persecuted by new edicts as never before. Shameless, greedy sycophants find an occasion in the edicts, now plunder the innocent day and night." Sounds familiar? The rights of the ungodly, not to be offended or upset by the Christians, trump the rights of Christians to speak, as in the Masterpiece Cake case. Unbelievers refuse to be offended by the religious beliefs of Christians, and so Christians are forced to accommodate to the lusts of the ungodly rather than the other way around. So the offense of the unbeliever trumps the offense of the believer. And this is the way that the First Amendment is eventually legally overturned. George Orwell once said, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. But that liberty is being overturned, especially in Europe. Now, in closing, I don't want to end on a defeatist note here. In the verse that I quoted earlier from Isaiah 29, about the wicked using meaningless arguments to indict the righteous, the context is that the day is coming when evildoers will no longer do this. And the text is written not only to describe how bad things became in ancient Israel, but to also encourage God's people that it's going to be over soon. Isaiah chapter 29, verse 20. For the ruthless will come to an end, and the scorner will be finished. Indeed, all those who are intent on doing evil will be cut off, who cause a person to be indicted by a word, and ensnare him who adjudicates at the gate, and defraud the one in the right with meaningless arguments. Then down in verse 23, indeed, they will sanctify the Holy One of Jacob, and will stand in awe of the God of Israel. Those who err in mind will know the truth, and those who criticize will accept instruction. And when will this take place? In just a little while, when God establishes the kingdom of Christ. Now some commentary on the culture. So I've been reading Andrew Klavan's testimony, The Great Good Thing. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. You will not be disappointed putting out $15 for this hardcover book. In fact, once you read it, you'll probably buy copies to give to your non-Christian friends. And the book is filled with many great illustrations about the current culture. And there is one I think is particularly relevant to today's discussion. Remember, as I just explained, what is happening in America is that the legal changes are following the ideological cultural changes. Remember, politics is downstream from culture. Politics only follow the culture. And in the same way, the courts follow the culture. Back in 2003, in Lawrence versus Texas, the Supreme Court legalized homosexuality, saying it was unconstitutional for any state to have sodomy laws. Then 15 years later, we have gay marriage, bathroom choice, gender nonconformity, transgenderism. And although it looks as if the courts were creating this decadence, and they are in part, the courts are mostly following the culture. The intellectual centers in America have abandoned any belief in God and in Christian morality, and what is following is decadence in the culture and decadence in the law. We're having broken marriages, failing students, drugs, immorality, crime, lawlessness. And this is how a culture turns into a primitive, backward culture. And we're seeing it right before our eyes. Again, this is Romans chapter 1. A people abandon God. Then they become unthankful. They become futile in their speculations and in their ideologies. Then they create for themselves false gods. Then they give themselves over to degrading passions, gross immoralities. Nobody sees anything wrong with erasing gender distinctions. And this becomes the new norms, supported by the law. And the change of law is the final step. So here is Klavan's story that illustrates well the reason for the moral decline in America while he was a student at Berkeley back in the 1970s. The intellectual culture was moving from liberalism, modernism, to what is called postmodernism. Now, if you understand this, you will understand what is happening in America. Klavan writes, and this is lengthy, but hang in there. I went to college just as the ideas often called postmodernism were rising up through the education system. Up to that time, under modernism, academics and intellectuals had considered themselves participants in a great conversation, an interchange carried on across the centuries by major thinkers and artists of the Western canon. The idea was that by studying this conversation, you could move closer to the truth and so find a fuller wisdom about reality and what made for the good life. Now, though, those intellectuals who derided and even denounced the Western canon and Western values in general had come to the forefront. Literature was no longer to be loved and learned from, but deconstructed to reveal its secret prejudices and power plays. Language itself was now considered not a rude tool for transmitting meaning, but a political instrument of imperialism and oppression that needed radical criticism. The very idea of truth was being rejected. All morals were relative, all cultures equally legitimate. Now, here's the interesting part. The professors who had studied literature under the old system, old liberalism, old modernism, were on the defensive and had lost their confidence. I remember sitting in a class on Alfred Lord Tennyson, a poet of high genius who often comes under attack now for his Victorian values. The professor was lecturing to the auditorium full of students about the charge of the Light Brigade. The poem is a brilliant description of a disastrous but courageous charge on a Russian cannon emplacement by 600 British cavalrymen in 1854 during the Crimean War. The professor, a mild-mannered woman in her 40s, was discussing the poem with gentle enthusiasm when a very serious young lady with a very serious pair of spectacles rose from one of the front seats and demanded angrily, "How can we even read this poem when all it does is glorify war?" The professor's face went blank. Clearly, she was the product of the old school. She studied the literature because she loved literature, not because she wanted to use it to preen herself on her own political virtue. She had never had to defend the beauty of beauty before, or the wisdom of wisdom. She smiled, embarrassed. She shrugged weakly. "I see what you mean," she said. At the back of the auditorium, I leapt to my feet, appalled. Here was a poem I had actually read, and I loved it. I still do, because it's great. Inarticulate with passion, I began to slap my open volume of Tennyson with the back of my hand, reading the opening lines aloud and saying, "Listen, listen to this, listen. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. All in the valley of death rode the 600. You can hear the horses. You can, listen. You can feel the courage and the madness. Everything, it's all there." I babbled on like that for a few more seconds, then dropped back into my seat, blushed, feeling like an idiot. The professor made a bland gesture in my direction as if to say, "Yes, yes, I suppose it's something like that," and then continued with her lecture. Such survivors from the old days could raise no defense against postmodern onslaught. So here's the lesson. The old guard of teachers, the liberal modernists, not believing in God or the Christian foundation, could not defend the values they took for granted. But this new generation of intellectuals, so-called, in their pride and in their arrogance, were ready not only to throw off God, like the older generation, but also to throw off all the benefits of God, all the leftover morality of God. Why? Because the gifts and Christian culture are from God, and it is God they hate. It's an attack on everything that is good in this world, anything that is tangentially connected to God's truth, whether they be words or logic or history or gender or nations. Why? Because they are the haters of the good. They hate everything good because they hate God. And this is what we read in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. "But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come." And then a list is given. Men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, and notice how it ends, haters of good. And in this is how an ungodly culture, ungodly families move back into a primitive, immoral state of being. And this is how you get third world, uneducated, barbarians, primitive, immoral, superstitious, perverted. When men abandon God, men become Neanderthals. They become perverts. And the new barbarians are attacking at the gates. Now, you may not be able to remember all this about the philosophy of postmodernism, but just remember the principle of 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 3. These people are the haters of the good, and that explains everything that's happening in America, culturally, and legally. Now, one news story. The big story we're hearing every day. The lead story in the media this week is about the children of incarcerated illegal immigrants being separated from their parents. And the reason for this is that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that children of illegal immigrants cannot be held in prison with their parents. And the reason for this ruling from the left-leaning Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals was to make it difficult for the government to accommodate separate housing for all of these children, to force the government to release illegal immigrants onto the street to catch and release. And so under the Obama administration, the government began to practice catch and release when it came to illegal immigrants coming with children and family. And so guess what? Illegal immigrants started to bring children with them because it was a free ticket into America. So now the flow of illegal immigrants with families is overwhelming, and the Trump administration started to enforce the law. Parents would be arrested, and children would be housed separately, sent into foster care while their parents were jailed. This is what the brouhaha is all about. Now remember, these are not families who have applied for U.S. citizenship. These are not families that have arrived at the border stations seeking asylum. These are the bullies that cut in line, that believe it's their right to ignore the law, put themselves in front of other families who have applied legally for citizenship and for a green card. And of course, yes, we feel sorry for those people who have learned to live by the law of the jungle, to do whatever it takes to get ahead. But we actually have to honor those who have applied legally. Every year, there are 6 million applications for citizenship. About 1 million are granted citizenship. So you have a 1 in 6 chance. So just keep trying. Within a few years, you'll probably be able to get into the United States. Now, even though this incarceration law has been on the books for years, it was enforced at times under the Obama administration, but the media has now turned it into the lead story every day. And this might seem cynical on my part, but there is plenty of evidence to prove that this outrage from the media is not about the children, but about trying to bring down the Trump administration. This is virtue signaling from the left to advance the narrative that they are the party of compassion and morality. In a story in The Hill, Democratic Chuck Schumer rejected the GOP's proposal to fix the problem. Schumer said the Democrats would not support a Republican bill to keep immigrant families together. They want to keep the focus on Trump. So they think they finally have President Trump, that they finally have the magic bullet to open the borders, the plight of children. Now, Congress can fix this overnight by passing a law allowing the children and parents to be held together. Right before I actually began recording this program, the news announced that President Trump signed an executive order to keep these families together. But don't think that the media will stop. My guess is the media is now going to complain that these children are being held in detention with their parents. But here's the real problem: putting in jail people who illegally cross our borders. Now, the logic is this: if you break our laws by trying to get into the U.S. illegally, you need to be punished. Otherwise, you're just going to keep doing it again and again. And so those who cross our borders illegally are sent to jail anywhere between 6 months and 2 years. But there's a problem here. It costs U.S. taxpayers way too much money to jail illegal border crossers. And if a Mexican comes across with his family and is jailed, it's really not that much of a punishment. They get free housing, free medical care, free meals. Their children get to go to foster care. They're fed. They're educated. It's like sending your children to boarding school for free. So my suggestion is this: get America out of the business of jailing illegal immigrants. As soon as they're caught, put them on government buses and government planes, drop them off at the capitals of their home countries, then charge those countries tariffs on their products to pay for the housing and the transportation of the illegals. The more the same illegals keep trying to come over, the higher the tariffs become. Soon those countries would get the message and begin to police their own people trying to leave the country. But I doubt anyone is going to follow this advice, because generally politicians are too weak to force these countries to take their people back. So it's likely we're going to be stuck with this problem for a long time. Because Isaiah 59:9, therefore justice is far from us, righteousness doesn't overtake us. We hope for light, but behold darkness, for brightness, but we walk in gloom. We grope along the wall like blind men. We grope like those who have no eyes. You see, when a people abandon God, they become blind to the obvious solution to every problem. They even become blind to the gospel, which is the solution to our main problem, sin. Well, thanks for listening today. I'm off to Bridgefest this weekend in Ocean Grove. The radio station I broadcast from in New Jersey has an event every year in Ocean Grove on the boardwalk. I get to set up a tent and a table for God and Country Radio, and it's always a great time to converse with listeners. My contact information is on the closing slide. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button on the YouTube page, and may God bless you as you continue to live by His word.